This really freaked out the Real Networks employees. They tried to communicate and they tried to get them to leave. I think offering various inducements to do so. And to their credit, the anti-spammers said, we're here until the end of our protest, and then we would be happy to have a conversation with you. Then they eventually brought a few of these folks who stayed behind up to their headquarters to have a meeting and to talk about what the issue was and how they could try to get out of all of the bad press this had caused. Real Networks' PR rep at the time was a woman who is now a Democratic senator for Washington State, Maria Cantwell. She was a former House rep at the time, working in the private industry for a very short period of time, just a couple of years. And Real Networks was super alarmed because they did not know how to respond to this. And part of the problem is not only were they offering advertising, they also included spyware. So that in turn alarmed the anti-spammers and much of the net. It became a really big deal for Real Networks, and they eventually amended their privacy policy in response. Senator Cantwell actually credits this experience with forming her opposition to extending the Patriot Act. So it's nice to see that some folks might change their minds, and you can have productive conversations and go on to see some very good social change. So I'm not going to tell you too much about Spamhaus, but they were created in 1998. If you don't know Spamhaus, I'm not sure what you're doing here. But one of the things that's interesting about Spamhaus is their organizational structure is very complex, intended specifically to avoid lawsuits in the US. And to their credit, that's done them very well. A number of early blacklists were getting sued left and right, and it was very draining. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. But Spamhaus was not in it to have a legal battle. They were in it to stop spam. And so they moved their jurisdiction outside the US. Also, in 1998, SpamCop was started by Julian Haidt to deal with the spam that he was actually getting in his personal inbox. So his first SpamCop program was a simple 100-line script for dealing with the spam that happened to be in his inbox. Just, I'm tired of this. And he put it up on his personal website and just said, here, I have made this thing, internet, please use it for yourself if you wish. But by 2000, they were receiving over 100,000 spam reports a day. So what started as a personal project eventually became a crusade and a larger organization that was acquired by Ironport in 2003, and then Ironport in turn was acquired by Cisco in 2007. So these days, the SpamCop blacklist is integrated into Cisco's Ironport utilities and is often used even outside of that. And that's just something that started out of one person's frustration. Spews was another list that was started through the connections made on Usenet. It was blocking what it called spam support services. It wasn't blocking the spammers directly. They realized that other lists were doing that well enough, but what they wanted to do was to block ISPs and open relays and people who made mailing list software, and anything that seemed like it was there to make spam easier. It was also run anonymously, and in fact, it was extremely controversial, even amongst the anti-spammers. Some of the anti-spammers felt that this was going a step too far, that you don't, for instance, block all of Gmail because Gmail has some spam. But a lot of people supported it, and it did make a lot of change. I think this was one of the things that woke up a number of small internet service providers to the fact that they couldn't have spammers on their network as just, oh, well, they're just one of our customers, and we have other customers, and we're normally pretty good, and whatever they want to send, they're paying the bills. Well, that doesn't work so well for you, especially when you're going to get blocked by a spam support service list. But they were also listed at RFC ignorant, which felt that their means of doing this was a little much. It's particularly notable because it was the focus of a number of spammer conspiracies, because it was run anonymously. A number of the Florida spamming cartel, which included Spamford and a few others, got together and tried to sue a number of the people that they actually thought were responsible for this. But nobody had any hard evidence, and so the lawsuits languished and never went anywhere. It was deactivated in 2006. At this point, a lot of things it was replaced by an initial system. Orbs was on a mission to close the open relays. Again, from that spammer conspiracy website, that image. They used probes to test for open relays without permission, sometimes over and over again. So that created a flood of traffic that definitely upset some folks. Some people claimed that they were still receiving tests even after they asked Orbs to stop. And so, again, controversial. They also had a policy of adding servers to their list that they were unable to test. So if you were blocking certain types of connections, even if you didn't have an open relay, you might get added. And I think that was also something that caused some controversy. So he was engaged in a dispute with some of the folks who had been listed, and ended up getting more or less sued out of existence, in addition to having health problems probably brought on partially by the stress. So this was one of the things that a number of blacklisting organizations had to learn to deal with, was what do you do when you get sued by the spammers? And how can you do this so that you don't harm your personal assets and destroy yourself? So moving on in an era, we'll talk about the early 2000s. In the early part of the decade, we had the dot-com boom and bust. Content filtering became big. We had efforts to legislate against spam. In the later half, the limitations of the law became clear. We started to get authentication, image spam, rise and retreat, snowshoe spam, botnet spam, social media spam, and more complex filtering. One great story to come out of 2000 was the story of Nadine. And I'll give a brief overview, but I would encourage you all to go search for Nadine spam, because there's a fantastic write-up of this. Apparently on the second day of March in 2000, somebody that they'd given her a false name, Nadine, but an older woman visited a website belonging to an outfit called delivery.com, where she apparently entered a sweepstakes and got her email address wrong. And the email address that was incorrect actually went to someone who was involved in the anti-spam world. So she gave them some personal information and agreed to receive email from any kind of third parties, and consisted of her first name and the domain honet.com. And that's actually owned by the anti-spammer. So over the years, she put in her email address to just a few different things, her wrong email address, but her email address was shared many, many times amongst spammer after spammer after spammer. By the end of it, she had received over 90,000 messages in the course of 7 years. So if you go look up the story of Nadine, you can see when the spam starts to come in, and there are a couple of lulls in this where he's tried to get it shut down, and still the spam goes on and on. The website stopped updating the story in 2007, but my understanding is that he still receives spam for Nadine even today. Another big story to come out of the early 2000s was that AT&T was caught with what they called pink contracts. So like I've mentioned before, a number of ISPs had started out saying, well, they're our customers, they give us money, why should we shut down a customer if they're paying the bills? Well, by the late 90s, most of the ISPs had begun to realize that supporting the spammers was not going to do them any favors with all of their better customers. But it turns out that some of the ISPs decided that they could still make an awful lot of money off of this so long as nobody actually knew that they were providing support to the spammers. So AT&T was caught with what they called the pink contract, pink being the color of spam, where they knowingly hosted spammers as long as they didn't send from AT&T's mail servers. So you run your own mail server, we'll provide you connectivity, and we'll be happy to take your money, sir spammer, while heavily denying this. Somebody actually got a copy of this, and when this happened, it was published, and of course, the excuse that is that it was a rogue salesperson. But a number of anti-spammers have been convinced that this has been going on with a number of large ISPs, not just AT&T, for a while. So having that evidence was really helpful for them to make it very clear to the ISPs that this would not be tolerated. Let's talk about some early filtering techniques. Besides using a DNSBL, what do you do to block spam? Well, SpamAssassin marked a turning point where anti-spam technology was suddenly a product. Up until this time, most anti-spam work had been a combination of DNSBLs and scripts that people wrote for themselves or for their business. But SpamAssassin comes out in April 2001. It was a rewrite of an earlier application that somebody had put together, again, more or less for themselves. But this is where spam filtering starts to become a little more centralized and a little bit more, like I said, of a product, less of a homebrew solution. Around this time is when we start to see content filtering develop. So in 1996, iFile used Bayesian filtering to sort mail into folders, where they're just checking for commonalities amongst text strings. But it wasn't very good because it didn't have a lot of error correction, and you couldn't easily get rid of other words. So, for example, if a message is in English, it's going to include the word the, because that's in pretty much every sentence in English. So if you're trying to use all words in a sentence as a commonality, the word the is going to be there in spam and not spam for sure. So in 2002, Bayesian filtering was improved by Paul Graham's new algorithms that got rid of a lot of these common words and dealt with some better error correction. He's a programmer and entrepreneur. He's in fact one of the founders of Y Combinator. Up until this time, Bayesian filtering for spam had caught only about 92% with a 1.16% false positive rate. And of course, while those numbers might sound okay, those of you in the industry know that that's not going to work out for you if you tell your customers, I can only filter out 92% of your email, and a little bit more than 1% of the time I'm going to be completely wrong. After Paul Graham's work, he made it much more of a viable option with catch rates around 99% and a 0.03 false positive rate. So his work was really instrumental. So SpamAssassin and better Bayesian filtering together created a new era of content filtering, which in many ways was very helpful and also created some interesting challenges. Some content filters are not very smart. In 1996, AOL had a profanity filter, and it was searching for strings of characters within and without other words. Well, their profanity filter prevented a number of residents of the town of Scunthorpe, North Lincolnshire, England, from creating accounts at AOL because of the four-letter word that happens to be in the middle of the name of the town Scunthorpe. So this problem has become known as the Scunthorpe problem, where if a content filter is not sufficiently advanced, it can see things like this. It can see the word analysis or assassin and start to think that there is profanity because of strings that are contained within a greater word. So that was something that content filtering became infamous for and has been a challenge for content filters ever since. Now, they've certainly evolved and gotten better. Simple filtering gave rise to better Bayesian filtering. It also gives you the opportunity to immediately filter out misspellings. And in fact, that's very common for spammers. My understanding is that we have some evidence that shows that some of the 419 Nigerian scammers intentionally misspell words in an effort to find only the stupidest people who might fall for their scams. So if you are highly literate, you are less likely to be a good target for a scam. And so accordingly, they will misspell things and just make it so that anybody who's likely to respond to that is probably going to fall for the scam too. But on the other side of the house, that gives us a great opportunity to filter out misspelled words, especially with the prevalence of spell check. Now, that's one of the reasons for those folks on the sender side that it's so incredibly important to edit your work. Because if you want to get into the inbox, misspelling your words is a sure sign that you are likely to get filtered out. Strange punctuation also becomes a problem because that's when spammers try to get around things by spelling using slashes for the V in a popular male enhancement medication, and other types of means of getting away from things, S.E.X. In fact, I had a kind of humorous issue with this when I was at my last job. I was working for a sender and working with a customer where their domain name started with EX, explorer.com, something like that. And they had a subdomain that for their link tracking that was pages.explorer.com. And we found that after they put the subdomain in place for their link tracking, they started getting really bad delivery rates. And it turns out it was because of the s.ex in the pages.explorer.com. When I'm training folks in the anti-spam world, I like to occasionally invite them to put their mind in the gutter, because sometimes it's very helpful to think of what could possibly be interpreted here. Because of problems like this, content filtering does further evolve. It starts to create weighting, where they would say, well, this is too many spammy words, but if you happen to say these words once or twice, it's okay. They'll give points to words. And then, of course, in response, you get super short messages, because if I just say 2 or 3 words, then I don't have the chance to get too many points. And then, in turn, on this filtering side, very short messages get extra attention from the filters. You also get some degree of word salad. So one technique that you would see a lot is spammers essentially copying pages out of a dictionary and just putting in a spam link somewhere. Doing this, trying to evade weighting systems. So let's talk about our efforts to get the law involved. Until 2003, anti-spam law in the US had been a patchwork of various state laws. Those that had been used against spammers were mostly relating to deceptive practices. While some of these laws had their merits, they were difficult to use for prosecution because they often depended on where the spammers lived. So if you happen to be in California and the spammer is in Virginia, you would have to bring suit in Virginia, and of course you'd have to figure out the spammer lived there in the first place. In 2003, we got the SpamCop law, which was very controversial and remained so. But this was the first time we actually had a law get out of committee. Up until this time, they had had previous efforts to make a federal law, but they had never gotten out of committee. Part of the reason this one did was because California had a very strict law, much closer to CASL than to CAN-SPAM, that was about ready to take effect. and a number of commercial organizations were incensed and terrified, and so pushed very hard to get the much lighter weight CAN spam law on the books. That's also, though, when we get the EU Privacy Directive, and just shortly thereafter, we do get some prosecutions.